Meet Reed Lance Rosenthal, rancher, #1 best-selling, award-winning author, and unabashedly, unapologetically on the right side of the outstanding issues of our generation. But don't try to fence him in. Sometimes his positions will surprise you, because Reed is definitely his own man, with his own opinions. You might love him, you might hate him, but you won't be able to stop listening. Step over to the right side with Reed.
Howdy, listeners from coast to coast, the Gulf to Canada, and around the globe. Reed Lance Rosenthal on the Right Side Radio and the Cowboys Take on all the video channels everywhere. Gab Truth, Brighteon, Pradeon, Google, YouTube, Gag Me, Rumble, you name it. Please pass on the link, throw us a like, and subscribe. That really helps. Okay, first of all, happy Thanksgiving. Okay. Tomorrow is Thanksgiving. This will probably come out, be posted tomorrow, and you'll have all weekend to kind of digest it, along with the very first show of this two-part series, which is the presidents of the United States and the troubles that they faced and what that can teach us, those historical facts about what may be coming our way under a Trump presidency in these perilous times for the country and for Americans. And in the first show, we talked about George Washington, phenomenal, founder of the country in all sorts of ways. He's the guy who made all the colonists, all the localists, Americans. It's the first time everybody thought of themselves as Americans. And we talked about FDR, and we talked about Teddy Roosevelt, and we talked about Herbert Hoover. It really is a pretty good show. You should watch it in conjunction with this one, because I think it will give you great insight into what may be coming our way in a second Trump presidency. Because history has a way of repeating, folks. And though the problems we face today are in some ways similar, actually in many ways similar, but in some ways different, and because we live in a different day and age, technology, communications, internet, you name it, they will have their own permutations. But the underlying facts, the underlying, shall we say, instability within the society, within the country, within right now across the planet, that didn't change much from back then. So today we're going to talk about Andrew Jackson, who Trump, by the way, says is his favorite president. And we're going to talk about Ronald Reagan. And we're going to talk about Lyndon Baines Johnson, LBJ. And why is he in here, you ask? Well, you know, my research on all this, which was really, it was really eye-opening, really eye-opening. I included Herbert Hoover in the first show and FDR. I wasn't much for Hoover. I really don't like FDR. And I'm certainly not a fan of LBJ, but nonetheless, the characteristics of these men, whether you like what they did or they didn't, and the situations that they faced coming into the presidency are remarkably similar to what we see today. And hopefully you'll be able to interpolate from the last show and this show into what may transpire during Trump's term and interpolate further on how it's going to affect the country and therefore you, your family, your finances, your property, and your freedoms. First of all, let's start off with the founder's quote. And this too, like the one in the last show, is also from the farewell address of George Washington at the end of his second term. After he was fairly well satisfied that he had united the colonies into a country and the people into a national fabric from a bunch of loose threads. We are all Americans. Quote, "For this you have every inducement of sympathy and interest. Citizens by birth or choice of a common country, that country has a right to concentrate your affections. The name of American, which belongs to you in your national capacity, must always exalt the just pride of patriotism, more than any appellation derived from local discriminations. With shades With slight shades of difference, you have just the same religion, manners, habits, and political principles. You have in a common cause fought and triumphed together. The independence and liberty you possess are the work of joint councils and joint efforts of common dangers, suffering, and successes. Unquote. How true that was that day, and how true it is today. And we should not forget it. And as far as the ranch story today goes, I'm going to make it very short. So the cows are in. I told you about that here a couple days ago in the first of this series. And they're munching contentedly on grasses that tickle their fancy, shall we say. And they're roaming around finding the best little niblets, the greenest little shoots, and the tallest little munchies. Well, two of the cows got out today. Don't ask me how. I don't know if they jumped the fence, went under the fence. I doubt it. Jumped the cattle guard. I have no idea. But I had to run around for about a half an hour and corral these two, no pun intended, corral these two cows out there on the highway. Fortunately, it's a very little traveled state road. And finally got them back in when I opened a gate so they wouldn't have to deal with the cattle guard, which I think probably is how they got out, i.e. jumping it. So all is well on the ranch. All the cows are safely, I wouldn't say tucked in, but shall we say nestled on the leeward side of hills, munching their cud. And they are all together, one big happy family, kind of perfect for Thanksgiving. It's a cow Thanksgiving. And I want to wish each and every one of you the greatest Thanksgiving ever. You enjoy your friends, you enjoy your family, you enjoy the times, the food, whatever fun stuff you have planned to do. And remember that Thanksgiving is a time of thanks. And I suggest you thank your lucky stars that you are an American. All right, let's get started, shall we? We're going to start off with Andrew Jackson, quite the character. I mean, like Teddy Roosevelt, who we talked about just 2 days ago in the first part of this series. I mean, he was irascible. He was tough. He was gnarly. He didn't take any crap. He believed in what he believed. And he was a Democrat. But he was, as we know them, a blue dog Democrat. He would have been a strong Republican with slight rhino tendencies in today's world. And he faced a number of problems when he came to power, when he was elected in 1928. Remember, he was the hero of the War of 1812. I mean, the British just about took us down. Right? They burned the capital, the new capital of Washington, D.C., and he defeated them at New Orleans. Incredible story, incredible battle, incredible strategy, which worked to a T. And of course, he was a national hero, and he capitalized on that. He was not without his ego, that man, as most presidents seem to have. They definitely have an ego, although tempered usually over time. So one of the most significant challenges was how Jackson was going to grapple with the economic reality of what was going on. There was more and more division between North and South. The industrial North, the agrarian South, not dissimilar from today, the urban and the rural. And he was a firm believer in protecting American industry. And for that, he relied on tariffs. Does this sound familiar, folks? And he implemented very high tariffs on goods that were coming into the United States to develop revenue streams, not only to protect the United States industries, but to develop revenue streams to pay down the national debt that was lingering from the War of 1812. Does this sound familiar? And his tariffs were in some ways applauded, but they were not applauded in the South, particularly South Carolina. And his vice president, John Calhoun, was from South Carolina. And Calhoun got so pissed off at these tariffs and from what he was hearing from people back home that he resigned, which turned into what was called the nullification process. I think you'll see some similarities to today also. And that was when South Carolina voted to ignore the federal laws on tariffs and not honor them. In fact, they talked about seceding from the Union. And it was a constitutional crisis. And Jackson kind of tempered the tariffs a little bit. He scaled them back, but it wasn't enough. And this constitutional crisis grew and grew and grew, fanned by his former vice president, Calhoun, back home in South Carolina, and by the papers throughout the South, because the South needed to import goods to operate. And the South was beginning to be alarmed, not only at a growing federal government and the undermining of states' rights, but at the potential loss of slavery. And this was really the beginnings of the setup to the Civil War. And we talked about Abraham Lincoln in the last show. So what he did was he reached a compromise measure. It was called the Tariff of 1833. And it scaled back the original tariffs and within that measure would scale back tariffs over time. South Carolina was mollified, and they kind of agreed to go along with it and to stop their talk of secession. And that huge constitutional crisis was averted. I brought you the history of the Federal Reserve Bank. Go back in the archives and listen. It's a three-part series. It is fascinating, particularly relative to what's going on with the Fed, which has way too much power and which I believe shouldn't even exist today and back then. And this was called the Second National Bank. That's what it was called. There was a First National Bank and then the Second National Bank, because the First National Bank's charter expired, tried to get their charter renewed and step into the shoes of what was then the Federal Reserve as we know it today. But Jackson was really hostile to the National Bank. Understand that one of his precepts and one of his strongest campaign platform planks was protecting the common man from the elites. Does that sound familiar? And he viewed the Second National Bank as an instrumentality of the elites, particularly the industrial North. Jackson is a Southerner, or was a Southerner. So he did everything he could to block the formation of the Second National Bank. And he endured the wrath and enmity of the Northern industrialists, the elite, very elites he was talking about and protecting the common man from. And eventually the bank did get chartered, but Jackson, not to be deterred, literally through federal power and the presidential pen, took away all their deposits. He just took them and gave them out to private banks. And the Second National Bank, I wouldn't say it collapsed. Why don't we just say it ceased to exist? And he was very proud of that. And the common people who elected him were thrilled with it. One can only wonder what's going to happen with the Federal Reserve here over the next 4 years, because they have made a mess of things for the last 40, particularly over the last 8 or so. That measure, when he took down the Second National Bank, contributed to his reelection pretty much by a landslide in 1832. And when he got into power, Jackson kind of put the spike through the nail of the Second National Bank vampire, as he viewed it, to ensure that it could not rise from the ashes. And he was applauded by common folks, and he was denigrated, and worse, by the not-so-common folks, the elites. In addition, Jackson had to deal with the growing enmity between North and South. which he did his best to tamp down. He was a believer in the Union, just like Abraham Lincoln. But he was a Southerner. And unlike Lincoln, understood completely the worries, the fears, and the positions of the South. So he tried to deal with North and South with an even hand. And some say he succeeded and some say he did not. And I guess the end result, the Civil War, 25 plus or minus years later, was that he did not succeed. His administration was also known for dealing rather roughly with the Indian situation, dealing with Native Americans. It's on his watch, despite, by the way, the court saying he couldn't, and his advisors saying he shouldn't, where he removed the Indians from the extreme southeast in Florida and forced them up to Oklahoma, at that time previously called the no-name territories. And that was the Trail of Tears, which many of you are familiar with. And one of these days, I'm going to do a show on the whole dark stain on the pages of American history when it comes to treatment of the Indians, because it is a dark, dark stain. But anyway, this did not endear him, as you can imagine, to the so-called elites, the so-called liberals in the big cities. It did endear him to the more rural and agrarian folks and the southern folks who were glad to take the land of the poor folks that had been displaced from Florida and Georgia and forced to the dry plains of Oklahoma. I don't agree with what he did here, but he exhibited traits of leadership as much as you may despise them, as much as you may think his actions and decisions despicable. He portrayed the ability to have a plan, as bad as it was, and to make it happen, as ugly as it became. And that is a trait that you see throughout all these presidents. He also straightened out the economy at a time that it needed it. And he successfully averted a huge constitutional crisis and perhaps an early civil war. So Jackson did much in his presidency. Some great, some not so great, and some, in my mind, despicable. But nonetheless, the traits he displayed are the traits you see common to all these presidents that we were talking about. Let's talk about LBJ. LBJ is one of my least favorite presidents. I don't like his personality. I personally believe that he was involved in one way, shape, or form in the assassination of JFK, who I think was one of our greatest presidents. And perhaps JFK should have been in this lineup also. But he was in office for such a few years, just 3 years. But he faced, just to get off on a tangent, he faced the deep state. He faced the military-industrial complex, which Eisenhower, the president before him, had warned about. And he faced the neocons of his time who induced him to try and invade Cuba in the ill-fated Bay of Pigs invasion. And he faced down the Soviet Union in a nuclear era that is probably the second most dangerous to those we face today relative to Russia and the rest of the world. But because of his short tenure in office, I did not include him. That's not a slight. I think he was one of the greatest presidents. Who knows what would have been the fate of and the destiny of America had he served 2 terms? We'll never know. And like Trump, he was the victim of an assassination. Trump, of course, was the victim of 2 intended assassinations. But Johnson succeeded Kennedy. And Johnson was a visionary. and he was a dyed-in-the-wool Democrat. JFK was much more conservative than Johnson. And as I told you a little bit about JFK, or I'm sorry, LBJ, he took the bull by the horns. He did not back down. He got the Civil Rights Act passed, which Kennedy had worked on for 3 years. He got the Great Society passed, which greatly expanded welfare and giveaways and redistribution of wealth. Once again, I don't agree with virtually anything he did. The Civil Rights Act had its great parts, but buried within it were horrible parts, anti-American parts. It could have been a 5-page bill. It was one of those multi-100-page bills with all the nonsense in it. Where LBJ fell down was foreign policy, particularly the Vietnam War. He listened to advisors that had, shall we say, other motivations. Does that sound familiar? And he got himself and the country entangled in a huge mess, which eventually cost 50,000 American lives, several 100,000 wounded. At that time, billions of dollars, which are the trillions of today, and permanently blemished America's standing on the planet, particularly as a preeminent military power. Let's talk a little bit about Ronald Reagan. So when Ronald Reagan came to power, it was right after Jimmy Carter, the peanut farmer. And Jimmy Carter was one of the worst presidents. He'll stack right up there with Obama, gag me, Biden, wretch, and several others. He was horrible, and he was weak, and he was idyllic, and he was non-realistic. And he got us into all sorts of messes. Hugely high inflation, stagnant economic growth. This is where the word stagflation came from. He couldn't get the hostages out of Iran for almost 4 years. Botched an attempt at rescue, lost a bunch of servicemen. There was nothing he did, literally, that was good for the country. In fact, I remember back then that the great hockey game for the gold medal between Russia and America won, was the highlight of his 4 years as president. Yeah, an Olympic hockey game was the highlight for America in his 4 years. Well, Reagan came to power and defeated him soundly, by the way, 400 plus electoral votes versus 49 and 51%, 50.7% of the popular vote in 1980. And Reagan knew that we had severe economic problems, that inflation had to be brought under control, and he brought in Paul Volcker. And Paul Volcker ratcheted up interest rates, and I've talked about this in the history of banking, another series of shows you should watch, to 18%. In fact, I think at one time it was over 20%. That was the Federal Reserve rate, the prime rate. Mortgages were 16 to 18%. I remember those days. Unfortunately for me, I remember those days. But he got inflation under control. He allowed the country to enter into a steep recession in 1982, at which time Reagan was very unpopular. Remember, Reagan was also the victim of an attempted assassination. Sound familiar? And he's the one who really gave birth to the new conservatism in the Republican Party. Does that sound familiar? He got the hostages out of Iran literally within days of his inauguration, after peanut farmer couldn't get him out for 4 years. And obviously he faced down the Soviet Union and embarked America on a huge military expansion, which in the end broke the backs of the USSR and resulted in the fall of the Berlin Wall. One of his greatest speeches, Mr. Gorbachev, tear this wall down. Reagan was a great character. He was a great communicator, kind of like Lincoln. A little bit like Trump, but Trump communicates in a different way and with a different brand and with more bite, shall we say, and less manners, shall we say. But Trump and Reagan share many similarities, including, although we are in far worse shape now, intentionally, by the way. They face the same kind of problems at their various points in history as we face today and as we face then. Reagan, by the way, see if this rings a bell. He challenged all the politically liberal programs that had been put into place and that had dominated the federal government. And he opposed and scaled way back the growth in government that occurred under Carter and LBJ. And he worked hard to reduce the size of government. He cut social welfare programs. He encouraged a conservative social ethic, by the way, including towards reproductive rights. And he was a firm supporter of the role of religion in public life. He guided the United States through the end of the Cold War. Now we are in a Cold War that is simmering, about to become hot. Hopefully it does not. And Reagan, for all his accomplishments and for all the things which endeared him to the American people, I mean, he was a beloved president. The second election was 49 states to 1. I mean, it was huge, huge. One of the biggest electoral landslides and popular vote landslides in American history. But he made mistakes too. Does this sound familiar? The Beirut bombing. Remember when we lost 200 plus Marines in Beirut? And the Iran-Contra scandal, which was a huge scandal in its day. And that was the supplying of arms to the insurgents in Central America and the payola that was going on. In fact, the model of what happened in those years was used by Hillary Clinton when she was Secretary of State and Barack Obama, our buddy, in that whole mess that became the Benghazi scandal that we have yet to find out all the truths about, but we shall. And he also ignored the growing AIDS crisis, particularly in Africa. Something that he regretted, by the way, after he left office. So all these people, folks, they have a commonality. They came in at times of crisis. They had a plan. They were able to communicate with people, and they did communicate with people. They believed their power came from the people, not from the entrenched bureaucracy or the establishment or the elites. And they believed in protecting the people, not only against the elites or from the elites, but from the government, from an overreaching government. And all believed, with very few exceptions, one of them being FDR, in the scaling back of government, getting government out of the way of the people, and getting out of the way of the enactment and enforcement and adhesion to the Constitution. Giving everybody an equal opportunity, but giving no one unfair advantage. This was opportunity, not equality, as the leftists like to use. You know, you will all be mediocre and our serfs together. That's kind of their, shall we say, mantra. So please, think about these presidents. Think about those times that I've brought to you, and I've just skimmed the surface. And think about these times and Trump coming into office in these times. I think you'll reach conclusions similar to what I have, although I'm not going to share them with you because I love my audience. I love all you listeners, all you viewers. And I have a lot of faith in your ability to take in information. Remember what George Washington said? I told you 2 days ago. The people will make the right decision when, quote, they know the truth, unquote. And think about what it means for you, your family, your freedoms, your property, and the country. I'm just going to do a real short rat-a-tat-tat today. I mean, this is Thanksgiving. I don't want to get you too depressed. But we will talk more about this. I'm going to do another show over the weekend. And I have a really interesting topic. I'll tell you about it then, but I think it'll really kind of titillate you, shall we say. But we are going to talk about the Democrats' plans to undermine the Trump presidency and to undermine his executive authority. I mean, you know, the rats never stop playing, folks. They never go away. And we're going to talk about the landmines. I mean, remember, Biden, Obama's third term, said, oh, we're going to have a peaceful transition of power. We're going to be very cooperative and blah, 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 blah. It's like everything else they say. It's not true. And since it really is Obama's third term right now, ending, thank God he didn't get a fourth, I think you can expect Trump to be treated just like he was treated when Obama left office in 2016 and laid all sorts of landmines, the Russiagate scandal, the impeachment scandal, the Ukraine taking money scandal. I mean, you know, all the stuff. And with the people that Obama, now Biden, Obama, put into office and appointed to various positions to undermine Trump's administration going forward. Fortunately, Trump is much smarter than he was then. He knows how it works. He knows where a lot of the bodies are buried. He knows who's a friend or an enemy, we hope. And I think he has plans to judiciously use the scalpel, shall we say. You know, his famous line, you're fired. I certainly hope so. And we're going to talk about, over the weekend, the voter fraud, which has now come to light in various elections around the country. Remember that Miller Meeks is still fighting for her seat. I believe Steele and CA 45 lost the seat, which is really a shame by, you know, a couple hundred votes. Folks, your votes matter. They matter. Get off the couch. Get involved. And take a look at our Take Action page, recommended contribution page, and our Facebook posts, and contribute to this, I think, last, and if not the last, the second to last congressional race in the country. We need every vote in the House of Representatives, okay? This is not going to be easy, what needs to be done. Not going to be easy at all. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about what's going on the COVID front, because one of the Democrats said, and I'll bring this to you over the weekend, that the upcoming times will be times of pandemic and pestilence. Oh, well, what do they have planned now? But in the good news front, on the litigation front on COVID, and I keep telling you, if you have a claim, bring it. It is the American thing to do. Hold these people accountable so it never happens again and get paid for doing it. But a gal was awarded $12 million by a jury just a few weeks ago against her employer because they fired her because she refused to take the jab. This is a really big case, and it's the one of many, and we'll talk about it here this weekend. So this is Reed Lance Rosenthal on the Right Side Radio and the Cowboys Take. Once again, have a terrific, safe, and absolutely joyful Thanksgiving. And remember to give thanks that you're an American and we are all Americans. Keep the wind at your back. Talk to you in a few days.
Please remember, if you've missed any shows, just click on Show Archive and you'll find all of his shows. We look forward to seeing you here again next week for another episode of Reed Lance Rosenthal on the Right Side.